All right, now that we've done periodization and eras, it's time to move on to the sexagenary cycle and the lunar calendar. And I'm going to approach those in that order. Until the 20th century, the calendrical system used in Japan, in other words, the calendar system used in Japan and in China, was different from that used in Europe and the Americas. There were two principal differences, and these are the things that I want to cover today. The first concerned the method of keeping track of the passing years, or the succession of years. And the second was a method for dividing up the year, i.e. how many months there were in a year. Okay. Now, we kind of looked at one method of that method of keeping track of the passing years when we looked at the rain titles, when we looked at Nengo, because we could see that different years, different numbers within a Nengo. So Nengo, if you said something like Bunka 3 or Bunka 5 or something like that, that certainly is keeping track of the years. But there's another important method that we're going to cover today. So I'm going to start with the cycles. The Chinese and the Japanese and the Koreans reckon the passage of time in cycles. Both days and years, and actually even months, were tracked in cycles of 60, designated by the permutations of the so-called 10 heavenly stems and the 12 earthly branches. Now I'm going to front load a whole bunch of abstract stuff for you right here, and then I'm going to give you some real concrete examples. The Japanese refer to this system, the Chinese zodiac, as Eto. And the cycle itself had a real impact on history. The first day of the cycle, or the first year of a cycle, the Kinoe day, was believed to be very auspicious, and therefore many events like launching a rebellion, making some big important political move, were timed to occur on such days. So what are these cycles? How do they come together? The heavenly stems, earthly branches, how does that come together to 60? Let me try and spell it all out for you. We're going to start with the heavenly stems. The heavenly stems are referred to in Japan in terms of the 5 elements, the traditional 5 elements: wood, fire, earth, metal, and water. Each stem is either what they call the older brother or the younger brother of the elements. You got 5 elements and you've got 10 heavenly stems. And I'll put these all together for you here on the next slide on a chart. I should also mention, though, and we're going to come back to this when we do ordinal systems, that an important use of the heavenly stems is not just in the sexagenary cycle, but it's also as an ordinal system. So here's a basic chart. On the left, we have the 5 elements with their onyomi. They should be familiar to you because you know the days of the week. And then on the right, we have the 10 heavenly stems with their onyomi. Okay, so if you see this kanji, it could be pronounced ko, and indeed when it's being used as an ordinal, usually you use the onyomi, so you'd say ko otsu. It's like sub A, sub B, okay? But if you were referring to that character alone and not in an ordinal system, then you would refer to it as kino-e. And then there's kino-to. So this is kino-e, kino-to. The older brother of wood, the younger brother of wood. So if you don't know those kanji, this is older brother, ani. And this is younger brother, ototo. And then we have hino-e, the older brother of fire, hino-to, the younger brother of fire. Tsuchi-no-e, the older brother of earth, tsuchi-no-to, the younger brother of earth, etc., etc. Okay, so if I were looking at this kanji, and I wanted to refer to it and pronounce it, not using the onyomi but the kunyomi, I would refer to it as kanoe. I hope that makes sense. So those are the 10 heavenly stems that we see here. Now, where do these come from? What are their origins? I'm going to digress just a little bit here and show you the original meaning of these characters. They go pretty far back in Chinese history, and the modern meaning. In other words, if you looked it up today in the dictionary, what would it say about that particular character? And you can see in either case, either the original or the modern case, there isn't an immediate connection that, at least that I see. So for example, a shell or a helmet, how does that really connect with first? It's not immediately clear to me, right? So the heavenly stems are not easily memorized, I think, because of this sort of break from their actual definition. But they are still very important. How about the earthly branches? What are they? Those are probably going to be familiar to you. The earthly branches correspond to the 12 animals in the Chinese zodiac. So we have, in order, the rat, the ox, the tiger, the rabbit, the dragon, the snake, the horse, the sheep, the monkey, the cock, the dog, and the boar. And on this chart we have both the kunyomi and the onyomi. The onyomi is in katakana for each one of these characters. And when you look at these, you might think to yourself, well, some of those words are familiar to me. And indeed, here's their correspondence to those particular animals. You might see a chart like this in any kind of traditional Chinese reference. Now, some of these, as I said, might be familiar to you, but note that the kanji we see here in this row are not the kanji that you'd find if you look these up in the dictionary. If I were using a Kokugo Jiten, for example, and I looked up the word ushi, this is not the first kanji I would see in the entry. Rather, this is the first kanji that I would see in the entry. And then maybe as a secondary thing, they'll label this, okay? Usually, there are some exceptions, but of these 12, most of these kanji have the same reading as the ones that we see over here on the left-hand side, like ushi, for example, ox, or tora, tiger. So the ones on the left are the more common kanji for those animals. If you were writing outside the context of the earthly branches, outside of the context of the Chinese zodiac, referring to these animals, then these kanji on the left are the ones that you would use. But in the context of the earthly branches, you're going to be looking at using these particular characters. And I'll give you a little bit of a preview of what's coming up in other learning modules. These earthly branches have lots of applications. It's not just in the sexagenary cycle. So they are good characters to be familiar with. And you can find them in every aspect of Japanese life. I thought these were really cute. They're little cookie cutters, and each one represents one of the zodiac signs. All right, so let me explain what the sexagenary cycle is. Webb does a very poor job of this. If you did the reading for this lesson, you may have looked at that part of his chapter and thought it doesn't really make sense. And he is explicit in saying, I'm just not going to explain it to you. If you want to know, you can go off and you can look elsewhere. And then he continues on. So my job here is to do what Webb doesn't do and explain to you what the sexagenary cycle is. So we're going to start here with, on the top row here, we have the earthly stems. And on the bottom row, we have the heavenly, the heavenly stems and the earthly branches. And these are in the correct order. So in those previous slides when we were looking at the heavenly stems, they necessarily are presented in this order. It's not random. Likewise, this is the proper order for the earthly branches. Okay, this far left-hand column is just the label. So this kanji indicates we're looking at the heavenly stems, and this one indicates that we're looking at the earthly branches, right? So we've got 10 characters here and 12 characters at the bottom. And as I wrote on the slide, we end up with a series of 60 possible combinations. Let me be more explicit about what I mean there, okay? The first combination takes the first two characters of both categories and puts them together. This is it right here. Kinoe ne. Okay? The Chinese pronounce this the jiazi. The next character takes the next two symbols and puts them together. Or not, it's not the next character, the next combination. And so you can call these a combination, or you can call them a cycle. The next takes the next two, and so on, and so on. I think you can start to get the feel for what's going on here. Each one of these combinations is considered a cycle, and I'll show you a chart in a minute and puts it all together. And we keep going until we get to this point, but now what? We have run out of heavenly stems. We got 10 of those and we got 12 of the earthly branches. So now what do we do? The answer is that we return to the beginning of the heavenly stem row, but we continue in the earthly branch row. So the next combination is this. So we're using this kanji and this kanji. And I bet you can guess what happens next. Indeed. We continue here on the bottom and we continue on the top, and we end up with this combination. And so forth. And so forth. Each time you run out on one row, you simply return to the beginning and start over again. It's a fairly straightforward process. And if you keep doing this, eventually you'll end up right back where you started. And at that point, you'll have put together 60 combinations or 60 cycles. So eventually we get back to the beginning. There's a total of 60, and here they are with all of the different readings, the kun readings. Now I should say you can read these with a kunyomi, you can read them with a onyomi. It kind of depends on the context which one you would use. So neither one is particularly more correct than the other. So here's our chart. We started here with that kinoe ne combination, and then the next thing was the kino to ushi, and then the hinoe tora, etc., right? And when we ran out of heavenly stems, we went back to the beginning, and we have kinoe inu here, etc., all the way through. And once we get to this very last combination, mizu no toi, then we go right back to kinoe ne, and that would be in essence the 61st cycle, but really it's the first cycle of the next series. So in China, and consequently also in Japan, this system of keeping track of the passage of time is very widespread and effective. So each cycle is assigned to a year, and this goes all the way back into Chinese history. Let me show you. Here's a partial chart. Certainly doesn't go back real far. The earliest year here is 1804, but you can see that there is a cycle of 60 combinations, and then when you get to the end of that, you start over at the beginning. So the year 1804 was a kinoe ne year, and then when we get all the way down to 1863, we need to go to 1864, we end up back here at the beginning. The sexagenary cycles were established by the Chinese, and then they're adopted wholesale by the Japanese and the Koreans. What do I mean by that? Well, you can be looking at any year in Chinese or Japanese or Korean history, and if you're looking at the cycle assigned to that year, it will be the same in Japan as it is in China. Now, of course, as we already covered in the last lesson, the reign titles, the Nengo, differ because the emperor is different, and the emperor has his or her, or empress has his or her own Nengo. But the sexagenary cycles do not. Similarly, the lunar calendar is the same when we look at the months and the years, and we'll be getting to that in the second half of today's lecture. So although you may not realize it, because you've only seen reference to it in Romanization, and this is indeed one of the evils of Romanization, many things in East Asian history are named after the cycle in which they occurred. For example, the Boshin War, which was 1868 to 1869 in Japan, took place in a year whose cycle was Boshin. And so we refer to it as the Boshin War. Now, if you just saw that in Romanization, it probably wouldn't mean much to you. You'd think, oh, maybe there was somebody named Boshin, or Boshin must be a place where a battle happened, or something like that. But actually, the Boshin War is a name that tells us quite specifically when that war happened, at least within a 60-year period. And here is a photograph of the soldiers in the Boshin War. I just had to throw that in. I thought it was a lot of fun. That's right at the end of the Tokugawa and the beginning of the Meiji period. Here's some more examples. The Teiu no Nikai was a group of young intellectuals, and it was founded in 1897, and it has a cycle of Teiu. The Japan-Korea Protectorate Treaty of 1905 is referred to as the Ishi-Bogo Jōyaku because it was signed in an Ishi year. See those first two characters? There's that cycle. Just like this is a cycle. And another example, the Japanese invasions of Korea in 1592 through 1598 are known in Korean as the Imjinwaran because they began in that particular cycle year. So this really covers the borders. Here's an example from China. The Xinhai Revolution in 1911 in China was called the Xinhai Revolution because it happened in a Xinhai year. So I want to return to this chart that we looked at in the last lecture. In the last lecture, we looked at this in the context of learning about Nengo, or reign titles. And now what I want to do is focus on this column here that I had decided was not important back then. I said, oh, don't be distracted by it. Here, it says the cycle. You'll see cycle combinations, and these are for each year. And I really like this chart because it illustrates my point that the cycle is the same in China, Korea, and Japan. It doesn't matter who's keeping track of the calendar. All three places recognize that particular year, 761 in the Western calendar, as having that cycle. So while the Nengo can be kind of a bother because you have to figure it out according to individual countries, the cycle you don't have to worry about. Let me give you a practical example of cycles of years. And I'm not making this up. A few years ago, a man brought some paintings to the East Asian Studies Department here at the University of Albany. And he'd gotten these paintings at a antique store, I think it was in Vermont, and he wanted to know anything that I could possibly tell him about the paintings. And in particular, he wanted to know when they had been painted. The inscription on the paintings provided some clues. So this is what the painting looked like as he spread it out on the table. And that inscription is kind of tiny, so I'm going to blow it up and we can look at it a little more closer. Here it is, in case you can't even see it on that slide. There's that inscription. The first thing we have to do, of course, is decipher the calligraphy, and that may give you bad nightmares about the calligraphy unit. So I'll do you a favor and I'll give it to you in really clear characters. This is semi-cursive, and some of those you may have been able to figure out already. They're really not terrifically difficult. What do we have here? Well, this is the author or the artist's name, and this is the artist's seal. Okay. Oh, I'm sorry. This is the name of the painting. This is the artist's seal. This is the artist's signature, and this is the inscription. And you probably know this kanji, to make, right? And this one, summer. And this one, month, a summer month. It was made in the summer month of what year? Here it is. There's the cycle. So the year is indicated here by the cycle, not by a number. And we're not even given a nengo. So we're working a little bit blind here, but the whole sexagenary cycle is 60 years long. And I'll tell you, 'cause you might not be able to tell from the photograph, that the quality of the paper and the paint, in other words, how much it had faded or hadn't faded, told me that the painting couldn't be really old. It most certainly couldn't be, let's say, more than 150 years old. So in what year do you think this painting was painted? Here's that chart again. And so what we're looking for is the first cycle, the Kinoene cycle. So our choices here are 1804, 1864, 1924, or 1984. Based on the quality of the paint and the paper, I eliminated 1984. It certainly wasn't that new. And it wasn't as old as 1804, and it seems suspicious to me that it could be really even as old as 1864. That seemed quite unlikely. The paper was in pretty good condition. And so all I could really tell this man was, I think this painting was done in 1924. I didn't know anything about the artist. I couldn't give him information there, but at least I could tell him when it had been painted. So that's an example of how cycles are used, and I'm going to give you a couple other examples here too. The cycle, as I was saying, can be substituted for the numeral in a date. For example, the year 1964 in the Western calendar could be written like this. Showa is the Nengo of 1964. Showa, I'm hoping you remember, is a good chunk of the 20th century. So we can say that there's if we're referring to a year, we could say it's the 39th year of Showa, or we could say it's this cycle year of Showa. And this brings me to a particular point. Let me bring this up so I have an illustration. One of the problems with the Showa period is it's inordinately long. It begins in 1926 and it ends in 1989. And so there is more than, there are more years in the Showa period than there are cycles. Consequently, there are some cycles where if you use them to refer to a specific year in Showa, it might be unclear. You might be looking at the very beginning of Showa, or you might be looking at the very end of Showa. Happily, that only happens in Japanese history once, and that's with the Showa period. And also happily, it only happened once in all of Chinese history. And so this is still a pretty effective way of designating a year. How about this? What year do you think this postcard? This is a greeting postcard, a New Year's card, and we see the date up here in the upper right-hand corner. These last four characters are Happy New Year. So what do we have here? Well, it's Heisei. And there's the cycle. Everyone got that cycle in their brain? Now let's look at that chart again and see if we can figure out when we think that was. What do you think? What year was that postcard printed in? Let me go back one more time so you can look at the cycle. And now look at the chart. Here's the cycle that we're looking for. And we know that Heisei began in 1989. Therefore, we know that this greeting card is for the year 2006. I got a couple other fun examples for you. Here's an advertisement for a brand of soy sauce. It's called Kinoe ne soy sauce, like the best soy sauce. I just love that. One last word about the cycles, or I'm really repeating what I was saying earlier. They not only pertain to years, but they also pertain to months and days. Months you very rarely see. Days you'll see much more often. In some of the conversion calendars that we're going to look at in a couple minutes, you'll see days also. I've been focusing on years because I think that's the most likely place that you'll see the cycles, but don't be surprised that the days are also assigned specific cycles. Okay, so let me layer on top of the sexagenary cycle the lunar and the solar calendars. And let me also say, again, if you were diligent and you did the reading in Webb, he kind of mixes the solar and calendar conversation together in a way that it wasn't easy for me to separate out. So if you read the solar part and you're still a little confused about it, wait until the next learning module, because in the next learning module I'll be saying more specific things about the solar calendar that will then correspond to what Webb says. Okay, so the lunar calendar. Japan's first calendar came from China via Korea. That shouldn't be much of a surprise. That happens often. In the middle of the 6th century, the Yamato imperial court, which ruled Japan at the time, invited a priest from a country called Baekje, or Kudara in Japanese, in what is now Korea, to learn from him how to draw up a calendar. This is what Webb calls a civil calendar, because it was really an important calendar for the government, for the imperial family. So they borrowed this idea for the calendar, as well as ideas about astronomy and geography, from the mainland. Reportedly, Japan organized its first calendar in the early 7th century. And I also want to point out that the Diet Library of Japan has a really interesting website on the development of calendars, and it's in English. And I would recommend that you take a look at that. It's more detailed than we need to get into, but I found it really kind of fun reading. So that's a little capsule here on the slide of the origins of the calendar. But if you want more detail about it, all you got to do is look at the Japanese Diet Library website. Okay, so I'm going to start from the beginning and talk a little bit about what a lunar calendar is. You may already be familiar with the lunar calendar, but I'm not going to assume that prior knowledge. Each lunar month begins with the new moon and continues through the lunar cycle, which lasts approximately 30 days. So the lunar month is tied to the lunar cycle. The lunar cycle is how long it takes that moon to go around the Earth. Okay? The most usual way of referring to these months in the lunar calendar was simply to number them from 1 to 12, the first month, the second month, the third month. So we don't have specific names like January, February, March, April. We're just referring to them by their numbers. So writers would refer to, for example, the 5th month of the year, the second day of the 5th month of the year, or something like that. And in that traditional calendar that Japan borrowed from China, the months themselves had either 29 or 30 days, and that was established in the same way, sort of, that we have the same number of days each year in specific months. So that's we have the poem 30 days has September, April, June, and November, right? In the same way, in the lunar calendar, specific months, the 3rd month or the 7th month or the 9th month, are given either 29 or 30, and that doesn't vary. Because each month has about 30 days, more or less. It's 29 or 30. The 12 months of the lunar year yield a year of approximately 360 days. But that's a little bit problematic because the seasons are governed by the Earth's position with respect to the sun, not the moon. The solar year is of vital importance for particularly agricultural society, right? So really where the Earth is revolving around the sun is the thing that affects our seasons and our weather. And if you're a farmer, which most people were in early Japan, then keeping track of the seasons was really important. And that solar year is actually closer to about, as we know, 365 1/4 days. This is why every 4 years we have a leap year and we add a day to the calendar to keep things in line with the position of the Earth around the Sun. And this slide shows you that in graphics, the Earth revolving around the Sun and doing so in about 365 days. So the lunar calendar, again, is the civil calendar, sometimes called the civic calendar. It was more important for the intelligent, the educated, the intelligentsia than it was for the farmers. In the next lecture, we'll talk more about the solar calendar, but let me keep on going with the lunar calendar. So in that lunar calendar scenario with 365 days a year, there's constant slippage between the lunar year and the solar year, with the result that if you don't correct it, the sequence of months loses touch with the seasons pretty quickly. It doesn't take long. When you think about it, a discrepancy of 5 days a year is a whole lot more than a discrepancy of 1/4 of a day a year. So the Chinese and the Japanese, because the Japanese borrowed from the Chinese, corrected this problem by periodically adding extra months. And these are known as intercalary months. That's a great vocabulary word, isn't it? These were inserted in the year and referred to with the same number as the preceding month. So for example, the intercalary 6th month was an extra 6th month inserted after a regular 6th month. And that would happen about every 3 or 4 years or so. Okay. My students invariably at this point ask me, well, what if you were born in an intercalary month? Does that mean you only get to celebrate your birthday once in a while? It's kind of like being born on February 29th, isn't it? The fixing of a calendar was deemed so important that it was placed under the control of the imperial court, and we'll see more about that when we start looking at imperial court ranks. And then later in the Edo period, that responsibility was placed under the shogunate, because really the shogunate was running the show in the Tokugawa period. This was serious business, keeping track of time. We really take it for granted in our context. You know, we have clocks all over the place in our lives, and we take the Western calendar, we call it the Gregorian calendar because it was established under Pope Gregory. We really just take that for granted in so many ways. And once in a while, other timekeeping sneaks into our lives, most notably, for example, with religious holidays. Easter moves around, Yom Kippur moves around, and those are based on lunar calculations. But for the most part, we live under the Gregorian calendar, and time is time, and you know, who would think twice about it? But if you didn't have a watch and you didn't have your computer screen looking at you with the time at the bottom or whatnot, your cell phone, then and you have no way of keeping track of time, that can be a little bit disconcerting. So I want to talk about calendrical conversion. In East Asian studies, we often face the problem of converting a date in the lunar calendar to a date in the solar calendar. So for example, if I'm reading a text from the Heian period, it might say this event happened on the 17th day of the 8th month. And I can't just take that as, oh, that's August 17th, because it wasn't. It simply wasn't. Okay. So it's necessary, if you're doing that sort of advanced work, to know how to do that conversion. Luckily, virtuous scholars have compiled tables and databases to make the process fairly painless. These reference works enable us to easily convert the dates from lunar to solar. However, because the conversion will necessarily refer to the emperor's reign title, the conversion calculators will differ from country to country. So a Chinese converter or a Korean converter will end up giving you, and I'll show you a demonstration of this, the same lunar date of month and day, but then the reign title will be different because the emperor or empress was different and the reign title from country to country was different. For Japanese studies, the most popular choice database conversion is called Nengo Calc. I love that. Nengo Calc is available online. Here's what it looks like. And you can also download it. Now I'm going to play around with this a little bit, show you some of its features, but I also want to recommend that you take the time to download it. It's available in both a Mac format and also a Windows format. I've never had a student have any problem with the software. I've never had somebody come back to me and say, oh, it crashed my system or anything like that. So I would strongly recommend that you download it, and I'll show you why. If we look at this main page, what do we see? Well, it gives us a database choice, and I'm going to say more about what Tsuchihashi is in a couple minutes. We can sort by year. Here, I'll do this pull down menu, and you can see this goes chronologically, and these are all the different Nengo, okay? Or we could sort alphabetically by the Nengo itself. So if we know the Nengo name, but we're not sure what year that was, we could do it that way, okay? And then we can put in a specific date. You can see our choices and a month. This number is going to be the year number associated with the Nengo, and this one with the month, and this one with the date. Okay, so just kind of randomly go down here. I'll pick something. Notice it's intuitive, so it knows that in Nimpei there were only 4 years. If you could choose one, I'll say the 3rd year of Nimpei, and I want to know what the 9th day of the 4th month was. When I do that, it repeats for me what the Japanese date is that I've input here, and then it tells me that that date in the Western calendar was the year 1153, and here you might think, oh, that's April 5th, but actually it's May 4th, because this is done according to European style. This Nengo calc was originally put together by a German man, so you have to keep in mind that these are done according to that sort of more traditional European order. And then it gives us the cyclic signs. So that particular day, which was a Monday, had this cycle, and that particular year is assigned that cycle. Okay, so far so good. So why am I recommending that you download it? Well, here's the answer. I'm going to bring up what it looks like, what that window looks like if you download it. If you download Nengo Calc and you start running it, you get a slightly different interface. So database choice, okay, that's there. Same idea, because you only have 2 to choose from. Oops, pardon me. And the input, you get the year, romanization, and look there, Western date. You can go in the other direction. So if you're just working with Nengo Calc through its web page, you only have one choice. You can only go from a lunar date to a solar date. But if you download it, then you can go from a solar date back to a lunar date. So in this case, the 3rd day, the 3rd of May, 701 would correspond to the 11th day, the 21st day of the 3rd month of the 1st year of Taiho. Taiho is the Nengo, okay? And then once again, they give us the cycle signs. One of the things that a lot of students have a hard time with is in this version, they forget which is which, day or year. But if you look at that main page, you'll see the day comes first and the year comes second. You might want to make a note about that yourself. That's the only criticism that I have of the downloaded software. And lest you think I'll never need to convert a date, I'll tell you right now, you're going to need to do it for your homework. So keep that in mind. I have actually one other criticism of Nengo Calc. There's a small portion of the database that's erroneous. I keep meaning to write to the author of it, and I never get around to it. But I've discovered, because students have diligently done their homework, that sometimes they'll get the wrong answer even though they've input the right thing. It's not wildly wrong, but it is, the cycles end up in particular being incorrect. So in that case, if you're really being a stickler, what other options do you have? There are some other options. Those 2 databases that he refers to, one of them is Tsuchihashi. Tsuchihashi is a paper set of tables. Its author is a man named Tsuchihashi. The title is called Japanese Chronological Tables from 601 to 1872. There's a copy of this in the U Albany Library. I also have a PDF of it on Blackboard in case you want to take a look and see what it is. The book has tables for converting dates, plus appendices for computing cyclical characters, cycles for the years and the days of the week. It's nice to have. Admittedly, in the electronic age, very few people will use it, although it was the basis for Nengo Calc. And so because Nengo Calc can sometimes have errors and things like that, just briefly I'd like to go over what Tsuchihashi, how Tsuchihashi is set up, and if you needed to use it, what that would entail. So I randomly picked a page to show you what it looks like in print. This is a book that is pages and pages and pages of charts that look like this. And I know that on the screen here, it's a little bit fuzzy. So what I'm going to do is recreate it in a much clearer form on the next slide and break it down for you, annotate it. So what do you see in each one of those charts? At the top of the chart, you'll get the years in the Western calendar. And then in parentheses, you'll get the year in the Koki system. Remember that system, that wacky system that's on the far right-hand column of the other chart that we were looking at? I said you don't need to worry about, so don't worry about it. Okay. In the next row, we have the years according to the Nengo system. So it's Genbun. It gives you in romanization and the kanji. Genbun 2 is the second year of Genbun, and then it gives you the cyclical characters for that year. You got a lot of information in that one line. And the next line down, it gives you the cyclical characters of the day, the first day of the first month of the year. And if you have those and you have your cycle chart and you have a calendar, it would be tedious, but you could figure out any cycle day for that year, starting with that information. On the left-hand side, we have a column that gives us the first day of each month of the lunar calendar. So the first day of the first month in the lunar calendar was, or corresponds to, the 31st day of January in the Western calendar. Likewise, the first day of the second month in the lunar calendar corresponds to March 1st. In the solar calendar. The first day of the third month in the lunar calendar corresponds to March 31st in the solar calendar. And if you have that information, you could figure out the rest of the information between those days, between the first day of each month. Again, it would be tedious. You'd have to sit there with your calendar and sort of count with your pencil point 1, 2, 3, right? But you could do it, okay? If the font is bold, that indicates that that month has 30 days. If the font is regular font, then that month has 29 days, and that helps you do those calculations. If the month is italicized, that's an intercalary month. So this particular year had an intercalary month. There was an 11th month, and then there was another 11th month, an intercalary month. Okay, so that's how Tsuchihashi works, and as I said, that whole book is just chart after chart after chart that are like that. There are other resources. There's online calculators for Chinese calendars, and I've never looked for them, but I'm assuming they're probably there for Korean also. Those online resources will, as I'm hoping by now you would expect, produce the same result for the lunar month and day and cycle, because those cross the borders of China, Japan, Korea, but they give you a different reign title because the emperor is different. Now, the nice thing about the Chinese calculators is they tend to have a broader range of dates, and that's because Chinese history is longer. So a lot of the Japanese resources start in the 7th century because that's when Japan adopted the lunar calendar and when the whole Nengo system begins. But if you were working with earlier dates, then maybe you'd prefer using a Chinese resource. So just as a comparison here, I'm showing you on the left Nengo Calc. converting October 10th, 1780, here we see that date, into the lunar calendar. So here's the Japanese date. First of all, we'll see that the lunar date is the same in the Japanese result as it is in the Chinese result. Right? It's the 13th day of the 9th month. The 13th day of the 9th month. And the cycle is also the same. But the Nengo is different because we're looking at a different emperor. And how do you find these conversion software pages? Basically, just go to Google, type in calendrical conversion. You'll find a bazillion resources. And of course, it's not just East Asian calendars. There's Mediterranean calendar conversion, all kinds of stuff like that. All right. There are also some other print resources besides Tsuchihashi. For example, in the Albany Library, there's a handful. I'm going to show you only one because usually by the time I get done doing that, the students' eyes are spinning into the back of their head. And the one that I'm going to use is the Sino-Western calendar for 2,000 years. Sadly, it ends in the year 2000, so now it's become obsolete. So I'm going to use a sample data, and this is from Chinese history, not from Japanese history. Okay, so the Nengo is a Chinese, here's the Nengo, is a Chinese Nengo, it's not a Japanese Nengo. But the sexagenary cycle is going to be the same, and the lunar date is going to be the same. So let me show you how this chart works. This one, I really like the Sino-Western calendar in a way a lot better than Tsuchihashi. Tsuchihashi presents a lot of tedium in really converting dates. It would be slow to use. This one is, again, a book of page after page after page of charts that look like this. And I'm not going to go over all the different features of this particular chart. Suffice it to say, it makes it possible for you to tell what day of the week a day was, what the cycle is for a particular day. Tsuchihashi kind of makes that possible, as I said, but you'd have to be counting and counting and counting. And this particular chart, as you can see, is much more detailed. So where Tsuchihashi just dedicates a tiny little table to each year, this chart gives us a detailed day-by-day breakdown of each particular year. Physically, I'll tell you, this is a lot bigger book than Tsuchihashi. Tsuchihashi is this kind of little thin little thing that sits on the shelf. And this particular book that we're looking at right here is a much bigger, thicker, almost kind of like a phone book kind of thing. Okay, so what do we have? Well, we're going to be looking at a specific date. Okay, the column on the left is the month. The second column on the page, right there, you see where that 5 is circled, lists the lunar month in order. 1, 2, 3, 4, down to 12. So if you're converting a lunar date to a solar date, you find the month number that you need in the row corresponding to the year that you need. So I want to convert a date from this particular Nengo. I could go with the cycle too, because the cycle's right there, and the 6th year of that Nengo. Okay, so here I am in the right row, but you gotta be a little careful because if you're looking up a date near the end or near the beginning of a year, you have to be sure you're looking at the correct row, since the lunar years span 2 Western years. I'll point that out again in just a minute. So you find the day of the month that you're looking for across the top of the page. These are the days of the month, of the lunar month, across the top of the page. Okay, so far so good. So we've got the 13th day of the 5th month. Okay, and then you find the intersection of the month row and the day column to find the Western date. So this is that column, and this is that row, and that brings us to the number 25. Note that the Western month is indicated by bold numbers, sort of in a diagonal way here. We got, I know it's hard to see this bold. That's bold. That's bold. That's bold. Let's see if I can highlight these for you. Okay. October gets an O, November gets an N, December gets a D, and then we're back to January and to February. So that's what I meant by you got to be careful about the beginning and the end of a year, okay? Because the beginning of the lunar year will not correspond directly to the beginning of a solar year. To find the date we want, we just cross-reference the 5th lunar month row then with the 13th day of the month to discover the date that corresponds. And in this case, it is the 25th of what? Well, let's go back to the beginning of that month. Oh, there's a 6. The 25th of June. What year? Well, we've got 2 years being covered in this row, and it's indicated here. 747 or 748. So 747, we start here with March of 747 and end with February of 748. Here we are in June, so it's June 25th, 747. Ta-da! And indeed, if we went to Tsuchihashi and did that conversion, this is what we would find. There it is. Okay, so that's calendrical conversion. We've got one more learning module on the passage of time. We're going to be looking at the solar calendar and at hours and minutes.